Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I think marks a first. I don't think I've ever painted 3 miniatures for one video before. So here's how we're going to do it. What I want to show you today is a very quick method for getting TOS style crew on the table as quickly as possible. Or maybe not so as quickly as possible, but as simply. This doesn't use a huge range of colors, and it honestly uses some fairly, dare I say, standard contrast. So the sort of stuff that everyone's likely to have in their kits if they're already painting miniatures. The miniatures here, these come from Modifius. This is the TOS landing crew, and they're available both as 3D prints, as I've done here, or as a resin kit, which you can pick up if you don't have a printer. Now at some point I do plan to do another video on these guys where I spend a little bit more time on them, but for the sake of doing something as easily as possible, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. First thing I want to do is to touch on the actual size of these miniatures. Now because these ones are 3D printed, I've been able to rescale them at home and print them at the size I want. For the record, these guys are about 116%, so 1/1/6, the normal size that you'll get them in the STL format. The supports for that will work perfectly well. You can scale them up without issue. This makes them essentially Star Wars Legion sized. Maybe 117% might have been better, but this is close enough. Now I've chosen to do this because they are more realistic human proportions. So the true 28mm scale that they come to you as, they can be quite fiddly. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and if you do pick up the resin box, like the physical miniatures for this stuff, then that will be what you get. One quick note, with the arms and what have you on all of the miniatures, I did drill out the holes for the little pins that are in the arms, made it much easier to assemble, and they sit flush against the bodies. So there you have it. If you open up your resin box and you find that your miniatures are smaller than what I'm painting here, that's why. The main reason I've done this is because all of my bad guys are in this scale, and so is most of my sci-fi terrain. So bigger miniatures, as well as being a little more satisfying to paint, are just going to work with what I've got. Now because of these next steps I'm going to take, I've started from the new White Scar primer. In honesty, almost any white primer is going to do the job. It's not going to matter too much because we're going to shade it all over first of all with some Agrax Earthshade. Now the main reason for this is to accentuate the contrast effect in some areas. Oh god, this always looks terrible when it's going on. So if you balk at this stage, I understand why. But this is going to give us a stronger contrast effect than just using contrast. I really wish they had another name, but this is going to look cooler, basically. It's going to give us deeper recesses. Now at this stage, hardly representing Starfleet's finest, but you leave that for about half an hour to dry, and that's going to work just fine for what we've got in mind. So while this one is dry, I'm going to put him aside, and we'll start on one of the fellas that I've done last night. This is the Vulcan Medical Officer. So what I've got is one of my big soft makeup brushes here, and I'm going to use Praxetti White, which is one of the dry paints, although any white paint will do the job here. I'm going to work most of it off into a bit of kitchen towel, same as you would ordinarily. And let's spin this fella around, and we are going to fairly generously, I'm actually going to need more paint, hang on a second here. There we go. Start dry brushing this back up to white. You'll see by passing over the same area a few times, we get to leave that darker shading in the recesses. And when we put our contrast over the top of that, it is going to color that more accurately to what we want. So, as always with dry brushing, you want to have too little paint on your brush, like I did to start with, because you can add more. But taking it off at this stage is going to be rather difficult. So I am going to now dry brush, fairly generously, white over all of the crew. And sometimes you'll need to swap on down to a slightly smaller brush to reach some of those harder to reach places. But no matter what you need, just swap your brushes as you have to, and you will find it's relatively simple. Now after a couple of passes, the majority of the miniature is back to white, and you don't necessarily have to use white to do this. If you want, a bone color or something can also work very well, just bearing in mind it's going to change what the contrast underneath looks like. Now what I'm going to do is mix up the Andorian skin tone. Ordinarily, I would probably just use something like Frostheart, which is one of the new contrast colors, but I don't have it, so we're going to mix and hope. What I've got, this is equal parts Talisar blue, Achelion green, and contrast medium, and I really hope this is going to give us a relatively nice, slightly green-touched Andorian skin tone. Now once that's all mixed up, I'm going to get a little bit and put it on her hand and hope. Oh, you know, that looks okay. Okay, cool. Yep, no, that's nice. Okay. I always say, don't let me experiment on camera, and then experiment on camera. So however you choose to do it, once you've got your Andorian skin tone, start with the skin on any of your miniatures. Now, it's always going to be the easiest place to begin. Start from the lowest level. So let's paint in her skin. I cannot stress enough the incredible satisfaction of when an experiment turns out to be exactly what you wanted. So that'll settle quite nicely, and there we have our Andorian skin tone. I'm going to put her aside. If you did want a lighter skin tone, then just dab a little bit extra of the medium in there. I'm going to use here Fire Slayer Flesh on our Vulcan. And then we'll use Gilliman Flesh here on our Engineer. Now, I don't know why this guy is the only fella in the set who actually has like a department badge in his badge there, but it is kind of a pain in the neck. I really wish it was just blank so that it weren't quite so prescriptive. Whatever, we'll make do. Now, the largest area of color for all of these miniatures is going to be the uniform, whether it's the jersey or the one piece that the women are wearing. So that's where we're going to start, because anything else we need to put over the top of that, it's going to be easier if we've got the color down first. So for good old command yellow, I'm going to use Iandan yellow here. And this is where our little pre-shade is going to come in really handy, because Iandan yellow, bless it, has a tendency to go kind of orange in the recesses. But with that little hint of Agrax Earthshade under there, that is not going to go quite so orange. It won't be as prominent, but we've still got our shading intact. Now, if you do want a more, I hesitate to say subtle look, what you could try would be Nazdrag yellow with a little bit of medium mixed in. I am looking for bright, like obnoxiously bright, so this works fine for what I've got in mind. And speaking of bright, I've got Azurman blue here, which is one of the new contrast colors. And let's apply this all over our science or medical uniforms. Now this one, you could swap out for Talisar blue, though that's going to give you a much lighter finish. And then, no great surprise here, we'll use Blood Angels red to paint in our engineers and security officers. So there's a quick look at our lineup so far. Oh boy, they're bright. But a matte varnish is going to dull some of that down later on. I'm not too worried about the brightness. But now we'll move on and use some Black Templar here to paint in the trousers. Now I'm also going to use Black Legion later for some of the harder details like boots and equipment. And because Black Legion's got kind of a blue-black finish to it as it dries, this is going to make our trousers look like a different material to boots and what have you. Applies really quickly and will dry nice and even. Now before we get to those black details, I'm going to dab in a little bit of Liberator Gold to the badges. The reason being here is that I'm going to do the edges of them in black as well, although actually I might not. I might just paint in the whole thing in gold like that. That looks all right. Well, I'm going to do it now anyway. As well as the badges, any communicator lids, make sure to touch them with a little bit of the gold color as well. Now we're going to move to Black Templar, which is the darker of the black contrasts. As we apply this over the boots, first of all, you'll see, ooh, yeah, boy, that is dark. It's almost more like a very thin traditional acrylic. So take your time as you come up near to areas that you've already painted. But things like boots, trim on uniform, tricorders, phasers, all this sort of stuff that you want to be black or much darker black. Fill that in with some Black Legion. Goodness me. Why do they have such similar names? Anyhow, Black Legion, go nuts. I've only just now remembered that the faces weren't actually black. They had that kind of bluish tint to the plastic casing. Maybe Basilicanum Grey or even Space Wolves Grey might have been a better choice for the phases, but well, you can do that the right way when you're painting yours. Any metal details, I've now got Iron Hand Steel, which will cover very well. And I'm going to use this to basically dot in all of the little bips and bops. I'm not too worried about screen accuracy at this stage. I just want these things to be visible. So let's call attention to some of the detail with a little silver. And now all that remains is to pick a couple of hair colors. But first of all, I'm going to use here some off-white from Vallejo. There's nothing saying here that you couldn't use a pure white, but I think because we haven't really gone over with a pure white on her hair, I'm going to use off-white just to dab in these crazy Andorian eyebrows. For our doctor here, I'm going to use a little wildwood. And the beautiful thing is this will also cover very well over his eyebrows, as long as I'm careful about applying it. And finally, Skeleton Horde always makes a nice blonde to my eyes, so let's apply this to our engineer. Now, one of the easiest ways I've found to improve the look of contrast is a varnish. Now, it just settles everything, changes the look, and I like how it finishes it all. So I've got here, this is the Varnish Plus from Instar, and what I'm going to do is apply this carefully with a brush over the entire miniature. You can go ahead if you've got a spray can, you've got a matte varnish that you like to use. Go nuts, it's up to you. But this is what I'm going to use. I really like the Instar, it's a super matte finish. Now that ought to look a little more reasonable. The last thing I'm going to do is some rank slides on the sleeves, but I'm going to do these inspired partly by Strange New Worlds. The TOS ones, of course, they are a gold braid, but I think on miniatures at this scale, you're not really going to see it. So I've got here some chrome from Vallejo, and I'm just going to put a line around those that I want to stand out a bit. I'm not worried about it being perfect, because at this scale, a thicker line is going to look better than two tiny wee scraggly ones. And now with those finishing touches applied, I'm going to go ahead and pop base on them. Recipe for that will be in the description, so let's get a look at what these look like when they are all done. And there at last, our away team is complete. Now it wasn't really until the bases went on them that they started to come together for me. A lot of the way through painting these, I wasn't convinced by how they were turning out, and it was, honestly, bumming me out a bit. But I figured I'd just hold on, keep going until they were finished, because, as I always say, it's not finished until it's finished. You can't tell what it's going to look like until the last couple of strokes of paint go on the miniature. So stick with it, and you might have something that you're happy with by the end. And honestly, yeah, well, I think we could paint these much more nicely if you're looking at getting crew on a table very quickly, or say there's a bunch of you and you just want to hang out. Your games master or your storyteller or whatever has just bought the TOS box. Get together one night and hang out and paint a crew up together. I think it would be a lot of fun. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying resin, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all. Live long and prosper.